Hi everyone and welcome back. We are almost at the end of this semester, and this week, this topic actually will conclude our organismal diversity unit. So let's end our unit of traveling the tree of life with the animal kingdom. Here is our technical definition of an animal. So we are in domain eukarya, multicellular, heterotrophic, again meaning eat other organisms for their energy, so they do not make their own food. Now that we are finishing up, and if you are filling out that organismal diversity chart that I posted, you should be able to start comparing and contrasting various features of the organisms we've learned about. So a good one to start looking at among the various organisms we've studied are the nutritional modes. So what do plants do to get their energy? What do animals do? What do the fungi do? They do not have cell walls. So animal kingdom is unique among the tree of life in that we and a few other protists are the only things that do not have cell walls. And often throughout the lecture I will refer to animals as us or we, because humans are located within the animal kingdom. So if you fill that out on your chart, you will see for the most part we are the exception to that rule. So most of life will have a cell wall to it. The composition of that cell wall will vary, but animals do not, so we're unique in that sense. Instead of having cell walls, though, we have specialized nerve cells and muscle cells for structure and movement. So these things that other organisms do not have. Most animals are diploid and sexually reproducing, so we did look at what this meant back in chapter 8 when we covered meiosis. And unlike plants that we learned about last week that have multicellular haploid tissue that we call gametophyte, the egg and sperm are the only haploid cells in animals. Some animals undergo a process called metamorphosis, which is a major change in body from juvenile to adult. So these are animals like insects, other arthropods, a lot of the marine life like the cnidarians or even crustaceans will undergo a major change in body plan. Phylogeny. So we've been looking at phylogenetic trees throughout the second half of the semester. And before scientists were able to sequence DNA or actually do phylogenetics, and that just means using DNA sequences to place an organism on the tree of life, animals were taxonomically categorized by their body plan, which are general features of body structure. Distinctions between body plans, again, that's sort of the old school way of taxonomy and tree of life orientation for animals. Nowadays, we're in the modern genetic era. We can just sequence DNA. But let's look at some of the facets of a body plan, and then as we go through the 9 animal phyla, make a note about the different body plan features that each type of animal has. So the first feature of a body plan is going to be, are true tissues present? And if so, what kind of tissues are present? So 2 big questions to ask when we're looking at an animal and trying to determine what kind of body plan it has. Some animals that we'll see in a moment are pretty strange, and they sort of just barely made it into the animal kingdom, and I'll point out why they qualify as animals when we get there. But things like sea sponges are the only type of animal that does not have any true tissue. Everything else in the animal kingdom will have at least a tissue layer, and some have many different tissue layers. But the absence of true tissues is one thing that really sets apart the sponges from all other animals. And the definition of a tissue is it's a group of cells that perform a similar function. The second major feature of a body plan, and this will show up in our phylogenetic tree where a major split occurs within the animal kingdom, is body symmetry. And we'll see a picture of this in a moment, but how is the body oriented, basically? Is it radial, meaning you can cut the organisms like a pie and every piece look the same? Or is it bilateral? So bi meaning two, lateral for basically you can cut something into left and right halves. And the third feature of a body plan is going to be the presence or absence of a body cavity. And when I say body cavity, you may be thinking of maybe your esophagus or your digestive tract. But we will learn that the true definition of a body cavity is a fluid-filled space that separates digestive tract from the outer body wall. So it's not the actual opening of the digestive tract, it's a separation of the tract from the outer body wall. And some animals will have this, some animals don't. And some animals have what's called a pseudocoelom or a false body cavity. But for us in this class, we don't get into that necessarily. But so that's a little bit about the third feature of a body plan. Some other features of a body plan that I'll mention as we go along are body segmentation as well. And we'll look at what that means when we get there. So here we have our basic phylogenetic tree of the animal kingdom. Now this is assuming that some type of ancestral protozoan, which was that animal-like protist, is the ancestor of all of the extant animals that we see today. And again, this is assuming evolutionary relationships here. It is just a theory at this point, but it is a lot of what these phylogenetic trees base their ancestry on. So we can see as we move from top to bottom, the first major split in our animal kingdom is the sponges and basically everything else. So sea sponges, while they may look a lot like plants, and at one time they were actually considered plants, they are not. They actually fit that technical definition of an animal. But, I mean, again, just barely. They don't have true tissue. They don't have body cavities. They don't have any type of body symmetry. They don't have body segmentation. But, since they are eukaryotic multicellular heterotrophs with no cell wall, that has lumped them into the animal kingdom. So we can see animals, every other type of animal does have true tissues. And then the next major split is going to be, again, that body symmetry type. And then from there, we just keep having our splits in terms of how related or not are animals to one another. But these are the 9 animal phyla that we'll take a look at in a little more detail. And then toward the end of the PowerPoint, we will spend more time on phylum number 9, Chordata, because that is where we live. Here's a good picture representative of the types of body symmetry, radial versus bilateral. And what kind of body symmetry do we have as humans? We have bilateral symmetry, exactly. Picture depicting body cavities. Now, again, a body cavity doesn't mean just any opening in the body. Like you would assume the digestive tract would be a cavity, but not technically, all right? Our definition was a fluid-filled space that separates our digestive tract from the outer wall. So we can see here at the top, this is a type of flatworm in the phylum Platyhelminthes. They do not have any body cavity because there's no separation of our digestive tract from the outer wall. but we can see down here in our annelid, or the earthworms, we do have a true body cavity. And one more thing to keep in mind, informal groupings or informal terms for our animals now. Sponges, cnidarians, mollusks, flatworms, annelids, roundworms, arthropods, and the echinoderms are all considered invertebrates, meaning they have no backbone, no skull, no skull or backbone. The only phylum that has a backbone is Chordata, and not even all of the chordates are vertebrates, but all vertebrates are chordates. And again, we'll take a closer look at what that means when we get there, but this is also showing us that most of the animal kingdom is an invertebrate, meaning no skull or backbone. So if I were to ask you to think of an animal, usually the first type of animal that comes to mind for most people are cats or dogs or birds, lions, snakes, turtles, things that we're pretty familiar with. And all of those animals that you instantly think of are all vertebrates. And those aren't even covering the 90% or so of the other animal kingdom. So again, as we journey through the animal kingdom, keep in mind that most animals, so 9 out of every 10 animals, are not going to have any sort of skull or backbone. And now we'll take a look at the 9 phyla. We'll look at some characteristics and we'll work through the body plans to see what features they have. So for quiz or exam purposes, know the scientific term for these animals, so know them by their phyla name. And I would know some general features as well. So we'll start with the poriferans, or the sea sponges. They are stationary animals that appear immobile. And again, if you get any sort of old school biology book or botany book, you may see sea sponges lumped in there. Because at one point, if it wasn't overtly an animal, it was just sort of classified as a plant, but now we know better. They're the simplest of all the animals that very closely resemble colonial protists. So if we go back to our phylogenetic tree, we can see that relationship-wise or relatedness-wise, these guys are most closely related to the colonial protist organisms, but they barely made it into the animal kingdom. They're filter feeders. They don't have any nerves or muscles. And why we consider them animals is because they have a collection of these feeding cells called choanocytes that all work together for the organism as a whole. Okay, and so for that reason, there is one of the big ones why sea sponges are considered animals and not a type of colonial protist. Our second phylum, the cnidarians. The C is silent, so phylum Cnidaria. Things like anemones, hydras, corals, and jellies. So these are animals. We have true tissue now. We have true body symmetry, so these are all radially symmetric organisms. And they all share these nematocysts, or the stinging tentacle cells. So of course, jellyfish have stinging cells, but anemones as well. Tiny little cnidarians called hydra, and corals, believe it or not, also have these stinging cells. It's how they feed. They will paralyze their prey and then sort of bring it into their mouth part. Basic body plan, think of these guys as digestive tracts, just little sacs of digestive tracts. So they've got 2 tissue layers. They've got ectoderm, which is the outer skin layer, if you will, and then endoderm, which makes up the gut or the digestive tract. So true tissues, 2 tissue layers, single opening, and these type of animals do exhibit metamorphosis. So they will usually start life as a stationary polyp, if you can see here, and that will be attached to the surface of the ocean, like the bottom of the ocean or a rock or something else. And then when they become sexually mature, they will pop off, flip upside down, and then sort of live life as a Medusa. So you can literally see how the polyp is just an upside down Medusa. Some cnidarian diversity. Again, you do not need to know these specific names here. Just know all of these types of animals as cnidarians. But these are aquatic invertebrates with stinging cells. Our third phylum, Mollusca, or the mollusks. Things like snails, slugs, oysters, clams, octopi, and squids. So these are soft-bodied animals, usually protected by a hard shell. If you think of an octopus or a squid, you may not identify a hard shell on them, but they actually have an internal component. It sort of looks like a clear plastic bone, if you will, called the mantle. That is technically that part of their body plan. So then that would make them mollusks as well. They also feed by extending a file-like organ called a radula, and they are all unified by having three main parts. So they have a muscular foot, a visceral mass of organs, and then of course the mantle, which may become the hard shell in some or an internal structure in others. And our three major groups are the gastropods, the bivalves, and the cephalopods. So the gastropods are things like snails and slugs. And then we have the cephalopods, so cephala for head. So these are large-brained organisms like our octopi, cuttlefish, and squid. And then our bivalves, so bi for two, so two halves here. These are things on a hinge, so clams, oysters, geoduck, scallop, and mussels. And it always amazes me that the mollusk phylum is so diverse. I mean, you have everything from potentially the smartest animals alive, things like octopus and cuttlefish, in the same phylum as mussels and oysters. Not to knock on the mussels and oysters, but again, why these are all in the same phylum are those three basic features that we went over before. All right, moving right along. Phylum Platyhelminthes. So helminth is a Greek term for worm, and platy is for flat. So literally these are the flat worms. I'm sorry, Latin, not Greek. These are the simplest animals with bilateral symmetry now. So we have moved up in the symmetry complexity. These animals are characterized by having a ribbon-like extensive gastrovascular cavity, still a single opening. A lot of them are free living, meaning they're not harmful, and we can call them the planarians. But a lot of other flatworms are parasites, so things like liver flukes and tapeworms are a type of parasitic flatworm. So again, here are some of the platyhelminth diversity. We have flukes, tapeworms, so cestodes and trematodes are flatworms, etc. Our second phylum of worm is phylum Annelida, or the segmented worms. And this is probably what comes to mind when I ask you to think of a worm. So an earthworm is a good example of this. And these are all worms with bilateral symmetry. They have 3 tissue layers and a new feature of a body plan, body segmentation. And body segmentation is a subdivision of the body into equal parts. So each one of these little sections here is a body segment. They're extremely valuable, so they provide a really valuable ecological service, in aerating the soil and increasing the amount of nutrients available to plants. And there are two major kinds of annelids, so the earthworms and then also marine type of annelids, so things that live in the ocean, like our polychaetes or Christmas tree worms, etc. Interestingly enough, leeches are also a type of annelid. And our third phyla of worm, Nematoda, the roundworms. Now, by this point, we have gone through 3 phylum of worms, and there's only 9 phyla of animals. So this tells us that a third of the animal kingdom is a type of worm taxonomically. So there's a lot of worms out there. And the nematodes, if you've ever watched SpongeBob, a couple episodes, the nematodes invaded Bikini Bottom and ate everything in sight. Those weren't fish, those were actually a type of roundworm. So these are types of worms that have cylindrical bodies, tapered at both ends, and they're among the most numerous and widespread animals on Earth. So there are a lot of these. They're found mostly in aquatic habitats, wet soil, and a lot of these are very notorious parasites. But the non-parasites, or the free-living roundworms, are extremely important decomposers. All right, our next phylum, Arthropoda, the arthropods, crustaceans, insects, and arachnids. So think of animals with a hard exoskeleton. So these animals have bilateral body symmetry, 3 tissue layers, and body segmentation now. So we have gotten a very complex body plan. And arthropoda is Latin for jointed appendages. So these are animals that have many jointed appendages. And they're the most successful animal phyla in terms of diversity. So the nematodes were the most numerous and widespread, but the arthropods have really come to dominate the landscape with the sheer amount of different types. So 2 out of every 3 species on Earth are a type of arthropod. Body segmentation, specialized appendages. They have an exoskeleton made of chitin. And if you recall when we learned about fungi, chitin was the molecule that made up fungi cell walls. So that's the exact same thing there. And our major arthropod groups are the arachnids, so spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. So you can no longer call a spider an insect because it is not. It is an arachnid. The crustaceans are the marine arthropods, crabs, lobsters, shrimps. Isopods, or those little roly-poly bugs, are actually a type of crustacean. Millipedes and centipedes are their own separate thing. So again, next time you see a centipede or a millipede, you cannot call it an insect because it is not. It's its own thing. Myriapoda, meaning many feet. And then, of course, insecta, the true insects. All right, phylum number 8, Echinodermata, literally means spiny skin. So these are animals like sea stars, urchins, sea cucumbers, and sand dollars. So it may be weird to think of these things as animals, but they fit that definition, so here they are. And it says 3 extant phyla. Extant just means still living today. The whole phylum is marine. They lack body segmentation, and most have radial symmetry as adults. So it kind of reverted back on the radial symmetry because ever since we got past the cnidarians and the mollusks, we have not seen radial symmetry, but now we see it again in these. Most have an internal skeleton and characteristic tube feet, which are little tiny tubes at the bottom of the animal that help it to walk along the seafloor. And last but certainly not least, phylum Chordata. And it's called phylum Chordata because all of these types of animals are called chordates. And a chordate is an animal that shares these 4 features either embryonically or throughout its life. But at some point in its development, it had a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a notochord, pharyngeal slits, and a postanal tail. And we'll look at what a picture of this is in a moment to give you a better idea. Chordates also have body segmentation. So if you think about yourself, and you may think, well, where in the world do I have body segmentation? Our backbone, made of vertebrae, is a repeating unit of a body plan, or that is our body segmentation. And there are 2 big groups. So even within phylum Chordata, not everybody is a vertebrate. We have invertebrate chordates. So these are called tunicates and lancelets. So here's the lancelet here. But everything else is going to be a vertebrate. And here are the tunicates. And these are very, very tiny animals, usually marine. But of course, other than those 2 types of chordates, we have everything else. They're both chordates and vertebrates, meaning they share these 4 features at some point in their life, and they've got a backbone. So here's what it means to be a chordate. So dorsal hollow nerve cord. Dorsal means it is along the back of an organism, just like a dorsal fin in a dolphin. The notochord, pharyngeal slits, and a postanal tail. So in us, for example, we probably look like this structure very early on in our life. When we're probably a couple of weeks old, we will look very similar to this kind of fish-looking object. But as we grow and develop, some of these features will change. So for example, the pharyngeal slits that we used to have eventually will become parts of our ear, nose, and throat, etc. Our postanal tail gets eaten away by enzymes at a certain point, so we no longer have it. But at one point, we did have all 4 of these features. And things like lancelets look exactly like this now. So they really keep to this whole body scheme, while other chordates will sort of morph, and these features will change into other types of body systems and organs. So again, here we see we do have invertebrate chordates, so the tunicates and the lancelets. Now, they're chordates because they share those 4 features, but they don't have a backbone. But then we also have vertebrate chordates, which means they're chordates, so they have those 4 features, but they do have a backbone. So here are some examples of vertebrates. So these are classes of vertebrates. We have amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, and then various classes of fishes. And again, just the fish diversity alone is huge. So we have osteocythes, which are the bony fish, chondrocythes, which are the cartilaginous fish like sharks, skates, lampreys. And then we have things like the hagfishes and lampreys here. I always think the blobfish down here is really cute and interesting. And even though he looks like a blob, he's an osteocyte, meaning he does have bone, a skeleton made of bone, just like we do. Amphibians are aquatic and terrestrial, but they're tied to the water. So they still need water to keep their eggs from drying out, but they can venture onto land. So as opposed to the fishes, which are always aquatic, amphibians are sort of both. So they live partly in the water, partly on land. These are things like frogs and salamanders and toads. And another class of chordate are the reptiles. The reptiles, which technically do include birds and mammals, are something called amniotes. And an amniote just is a type of animal that has a special egg called an amniotic egg. And an amniotic egg, unlike an amphibian egg, allows these animals to venture much farther inland and not be as tied to bodies of water. So think of a chicken egg if you want to think of what an amniotic egg is. It's a fluid-filled egg with a waterproof shell that encloses an embryo. So here we have a good schematic of an amniotic egg. So if I were to show you a picture of this on a quiz or exam, just be able to recognize it as an amniotic egg and know what that does for the animal. So it protects the embryo, keeps it from drying out, gives it some nutrients, and allows that animal to live farther away from bodies of water. And our last class of chordate, the mammals. And this is where we live. So we are a mammal. We're amniotes with mammary glands and hairs. That's the technical definition of a mammal. And even though, like humans, for example, we obviously don't lay eggs like a chicken does, but we're still considered amniotes because our embryos develop within an amnion, which was that membrane that surrounds and cushions the fetus in amniotic fluid. And even within this class, we're going to go just a bit further into further taxonomic groups here. So we have monotremes, which are the egg-laying mammals. So echidna and platypus are examples of this. So only two types there. We have the marsupials, or the pouched mammals. Lots of marsupials. Kangaroo, of course, wombats, koalas, and who can guess the only extant marsupial that lives in North America? Our friend the possum, yes. And then the last major group of mammals are the eutherians, or the placental mammals. And this is the majority here of the mammal group, and we are also included as a eutherian, or a placental mammal. And it's thought that the placental mammals are much more successful than the monotremes or marsupials because as placental mammals, we form a much more intimate bond with our young, and so we would invest more parental care into keeping them alive once they're born. Again, that's just a theory, but I think it's pretty interesting. And it makes sense. So you all read in your textbook that last section about the human ancestry. Always interesting. Again, it is just a theory at this point, but I may ask a question or two about that on the next exam. And also as an extra credit opportunity on the exam, I will want you to give me the complete taxonomy of a human being. So going from domain to species.